Giving a voice to migrant workers during this Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, we want to highlight the Chinese railroad workers in North America. The North American Project at Stanford. The project gave a voice to Chinese migrants whose labor on the Transcontinental Railroad helped shape the physical and social landscape of the American West. So joining us now is Roland Hsu, who is the Director of Research for this project. Roland, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So, Roland, this is not something that's talked about a whole lot. I didn't learn about it in grade school, so let's dig into it here. How were the Chinese first even brought here to this country to work on the railroads?
The Chinese first came to North America for the gold rush, for the rush of precious minerals, and to be able to send money back to their families in a poor part of China. Subsequently, the railroad company that was building the Transcontinental Railroad realized they needed massive numbers of workers. So they sent Chinese-speaking agents, labor contractors, to Macau and Hong Kong and southern China to recruit workers.
So when the Chinese first came here, were they just entrepreneurs looking to work in the gold rush just on their own?
Indeed. Word had spread quickly. Actually, the Chinese in the southern regions of China, where we now call it Guangzhou or Canton, had already been traveling around the Pacific Rim to mining in South America and coal mines all the way as far south as Australia. They were entrepreneurial and they had a push factor with poor conditions and warring conditions in the region of China.
So describe to me how the process, they were obviously hired for these jobs, so they were paid. How were they treated during their time here?
Indeed. So many of them came in debt, that is to pay for the ship's passage across the Pacific, which in the beginning and then 1860s took up to 70 days to travel across. So they came in debt to the company. The conditions were harsh. That is, building a railroad by hand, if you can imagine, digging the roadbeds, laying the ties, and then bending the rails around the curves as they were climbing the Sierra, all by hand.
That's just incredible. Interestingly enough, I learned about it by watching a TV show called Hell on Wheels with Anson Mount. I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but I learned a lot about it. Then did you see that TV show?
Yes, it's very well done.
Very well done. All right, so talk a little bit about the treatment of these Chinese workers while they were working, because I'm understanding there was some separation between the Europeans and the others who were working on the road versus the Chinese. Tell us about that.
It's a good question. They're strictly separated, in part by language, practicality. There was no one in the supervisorial ranks of the company who could speak any of the dialects of the Chinese workers. So what we do know is that the Chinese lived in tent camps. Most, from the photographs, historical photographs, most Caucasian or white workers lived in cabins on the railroad ties, in the railroad cars themselves, with heat and water and such. The Chinese lived in tent camps. They had their own cooks. I was just going to add the railroad company was able to ship the ingredients for the kinds of food that the Chinese wanted to eat.
Okay, here's something interesting. I was just in Jamaica a few weeks ago visiting some family, and there's construction going on a big apartment luxury building, and some Chinese folks they live there and they prepare their own meals there, and they live on the construction site. And it reminds me a lot of what was happening there. I mean, obviously the conditions are much different than they were back then. But you said something interesting here. Photographers at the time did not photograph the faces of the Chinese. Why was that?
Indeed. Of course, we can't get into the minds of the photographers themselves, but what we do see is a consistent choice. There's wonderful historical photography of the construction because it was already considered to be a marvel, and the company was going to be selling it as basically a tourist attraction to cross the continent. But what we do know is a consistent compositional choice not to photograph recognizable faces of the Chinese. Wow. They were able to photograph recognizable visages. We see this in the images of white workers and of the supervisors and of their families, but of the Chinese, always from behind, so that we're able to only recognize them from their clothing.
That is interesting. Your research that you have there at Stanford, you educate folks on this very issue. Talk a little bit about letting people know what happened back then.
This project was a multi-year project. It took about 7 years with a significant support from the university and from foundations. It's multi-pronged. All of our research findings are now on our website, which we continue to maintain. If you just go to Chinese Railroad Workers at Stanford, and you'll find our website. So we were also able to give oral interview testimonies from family members who trace their ancestors back to those who worked the line.
That's just incredible. And before we go here, I want you to talk about why it's important to recognize this work that was done by the Chinese that came to this country. And furthermore, did they integrate back into society after that work was done?
On that last point, those who stayed tried to integrate. They were hard workers. There was plenty of work to be done to maintain the line that they had built, as well as to continue to work in the small towns that had sprung up along the line. They were good neighbors, but they were effectively burned out by the local populations. It was a violent story, including burning of the Chinatowns.
Wow.
In terms of why we should remember them, historical erasure is easy to accomplish but hard to maintain. That is, up through the 1960s, the federal government, when it honored the anniversary of the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, essentially didn't mention the Chinese, who formed up to 90% of the workforce.
Oh, goodness. That is incredible. That is incredible. Well, I'm glad that your research is out there for people to learn more about it, and hopefully more school kids will learn about it too. I think it's important for them to understand the history of the United States and the other cultures that contributed to making the country what it is today. Roland Hsu from Stanford University, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
All right.